Hey, welcome to Security GRC Decoded. I'm your host, Raj Krishnamurthy, and today we have Alan Luke with us. Alan is a 20-year-old cybersecurity veteran. He started his career with PwC as an auditor. He built the compliance team at Microsoft, and he's going to talk a lot about that today. Started with Bing, eventually went into Azure, and now he works at, heads the GRC team at Grammarly. Alan, welcome.
Thank you, Ross, for having me. Excited to be here. I'm not a 20-year-old person. I'm 20 years of experience, but I wish I was 20 years again, 20 years old again. But
I said 20-year-old veteran, but yes, but yeah.
uh,
Alan, I normally kick off this with, what is the one controversial opinion or a hot take you have? But I have a feeling that today, this entire podcast is going to be controversial. So having said that, so why don't I start with that? What is the controversial opinion that you hold about GRC?
got it. I would say my controversial opinion is that GRC is misunderstood. The core value and responsibility that GRC provides is misunderstood by many teams. The expected skill set and role that engineers have of the GRC team while partnering with them is misaligned or inaccurate. And even some GRC practitioners themselves misunderstand the role that we play in an organization. All that misalignment and confusion sometimes results in a perception that GRC is just there to pass audits, or GRC is not technical enough. GRC is a blocker to engineering. So what I'm prepared to talk about today is what I believe are the core responsibilities of the GRC team, the ways in which we partner with engineers effectively, and why I think improving GRC PM skills is more important than technical skills to add the most value to our organization.
Interesting. And why do you think GRC is misunderstood?
Well, if I were to summarize the responsibilities of a typical GRC team, first, I would say we aren't expected to be SMEs in any functional area other than GRC, right? It's especially in SaaS companies. Most GRC teams, P0 is to achieve and maintain certifications needed to support GTM and sales. I know most GRC teams do more than just that, right? But if a company, for whatever reason, needed to downsize significantly, passing audits is probably the most important task for whoever's left on the team. There's a ton of stuff that goes into passing audits, right? It's not just scheduling walkthroughs, routine evidence, routing evidence requests and screenshots between auditors and control owners, sending a billion nag mails when things are overdue, and blaming people, for not understanding what's being asked or when there's an issue. That's what bad GRC teams do. I actually think good GRC teams don't get enough credit, for what they do. You mentioned, my background in Microsoft, Bing, building a compliance program from scratch. First, you need to decide, what to base your framework on that can both scale as you grow and maintain. Whether you're shortcutting that process by jumping straight to the, ISO Annex A controls, or doing it the correct textbook way of doing a risk assessment first, and then deciding what controls are relevant. Nobody does that, by the way. They just go the Annex A route. You then get your set of things you need to formalize in the way of policy, procedures, control design, implementation, control effectiveness monitoring. For most controls, GRC acts as a partner to control owners, translating standards and requirements into control wording that auditors understand, into policies, procedures that engineers understand. Good GRC teams are able to explain the overall risk and objective, that a control or controls need to address. Co-designing controls with the owners, not mandating that something needs to be done a certain way. So this part might relate to the GRC teams are not technical enough, complaint. We do need to be technical enough to understand the domain and process of each control owner and their space. If it's a CI/CD pipeline related control, yeah, we need to know how code is developed, tested, and deployed end to end. But we don't need to actually ship code to be able to represent that well in an audit or in a compliance function. Um, and then next would be control formalization, right? That's educating control owners on how auditors will test them, how to measure and monitor control effectiveness internally. There may also be some recommendations to implement complementary controls, to support the main control, for faster detection and limiting the impact from when the main control breaks. Um, But then, throughout the year, I think there should be regular control effectiveness monitoring, happening. This is what people like Charles Nwatu at Netflix calls GRC plus A for assurance, and what GRC engineering teams, are being asked to do. What a lot of compliance automation tools are claiming to do. In my opinion, this should be the main focus of any compliance team. If you have a good continuous pulse on control effectiveness through your monitoring approach, then you shouldn't be stressing about audit season coming up. There's obviously different levels of maturity for implementing a control effectiveness monitoring solution. Um, I like to use the crawl, walk, run approach. Like to start with, you just need to make sure your control owners are properly identified, and having them fully acknowledge and understand their responsibilities, goes a long way.
So
It might
let
seem
me
like
make sure I understand. Let me make sure I understand. Sorry to interject. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying, sir. So what you're saying is GRC equals a big part of that is compliance, and the P0 of GRC that you called, right, is about checking the boxes because that's their responsibility. And I'm not trying to undermine the word checking the boxes, but what I'm trying to say is that is what you see as the primary responsibility. Is that correct?
correct. And checking the boxes again is like just the surface level, like the top. There's a lot of stuff that goes behind that, in order for checking the boxes to be actually be successful and to be like a real thing instead of just kind of, superficial thing. But yeah, I mean, compliant GRC is responsible for compliance. I know the G and the R stand for other things, but compliance is really, the end to end kind of program of making sure that, the risk and the requirements that you need to meet, are formalized and governed in a way to where it's manageable and it's operational. But GRC team is holds a special skill, right, in being the translator between the audit world and like the regulator world and the frameworks kind of terminology, and translating that into engineering terms that engineers understand to actually implement in a way that is natural, right? Like the worst thing you want to do is have GRC come in and say, hey, we have this requirement of control that says XYZ and you got to do XYZ, and the team is like, well, we don't do XYZ, we do ABC. And the GRC team is like, no, you got to do XYZ because that's what this says, right? Like, no, you gotta be able to translate that. It's like, okay, what is it
Got
really,
it. So
the
when you say GRC teams and when you put an emphasis in the premium over GRC team, and you said the word, they don't have to be technical and they have to have the sort of the project managerial skills. What you're actually trying to say is that they actually have superpowers. They are subject matter experts, but a different set of kind of subject matter experts, right? They need to understand compliance, they need to understand the business process, they need to understand the business context and translate what compliance means to an average engineer. Is that a reasonable thing to say?
correct. And, technical skills is relative. I don't even actually even know what people are really mean when they say, GRC isn't technical enough. Like, I assume every GRC person, has a level of foundational knowledge in security, in IT, in, software development, right? To be able to represent that, to be able to understand, right, what the process is, understand what the objective is of compliance within that process, and the risks that controls are intended to address, and be able to represent that and be able to test that, be able to audit that. Like GRC is probably one of the very few teams in an organization that knows how to question and ask those probing questions, right, and uncover the blind spots and challenge, um, when engineers say, "Yeah, this is good because we do this because it's configured a certain way and nothing changes." Like, there's so many things that can go wrong. You're one code change away from breaking something.
I want to pick you up. Like, can I take that example and maybe I want to drive a little bit deeper so that I think what you're saying is very, very important, Alan, and I want to make sure that people understand. Let's take that example. Let's say that we as a company are writing a lot of code. We are a software company, and obviously, just like most people are, we are using Copilot, right, to develop code. So, from a risk perspective, you want to make sure review is very important, right? That most of these codes just don't go through without any reviews and approvals, which means that you're going to put some sort of a review control, branch protection policies and review controls on your GitHub. Now, let's say that this is the context. As a GRC professional, what would you do to translate that requirement to an engineer? what will be the role of the GRC engineer to review those branch protection policies, to review those reviews? And what should be the role of the control owner or the engineer? Can you break it down for us?
Yeah. So there would be a requirement, right, from a standard or framework from SOC 2, trust criteria or ISO, or whatever kind of framework that is that you need to baseline against. I would say something like, okay, you got to have a change management process, SDLC process, which includes the legacy segregation of duties, requirement, which requires a second set of eyes, right, to do a code review or to do an approval, so one developer cannot push their own code change through end to end without being logged or second set of eyes. So that GRC would come in and say, hey, this is the risk and the overall intent of this requirement. Uh, what are we doing today that you believe engineering team or security team that you believe can meet this requirement? In the natural flow of your process, of your engineering process. I don't want if you're not doing something natural, like I don't want to force something that's unnatural, right, to
Totally.
do just for compliance. So they're going to say, okay, well, we're using, the CI/CD pipeline. We use like GitHub or GitLab, and hey, there's we have this configuration, right, available in the tooling that says all merge requests, all pull requests, require code review or approval when you're merging to main branch, for example. So then GRC team would be like, okay, well, yes, that's an option. If you're doing that, that's great. I mean, that's a very common way of implementing a control to meet this requirement. But after that, it's like that doesn't stop there. Some teams are like, you check the box, great, and the auditors come in and like, oh, is that box checked? Great. Is it centrally, enforced? If so, great. That's all. That's the only screenshot you need. If it's not centrally enforced and all the different repos can configure it differently, then it gets more messy. You got to test more things. So the GRC team, that's the superpower that I believe the GRC comes and says, okay, you set the configuration. Who can change it? If something changes, who gets alerted? How do we get notified? Are there any ways to bypass this? Right? Because there's always like a bypass, method that's off of the happy path. Like everybody's thinking about happy path only. GRC comes in and says, okay, what is the non-happy path? Is there a way to kind
Nice.
of bypass this, right? And how do we, and that's the biggest risk area is like, how do we develop, build monitors or alerts, to be alerted, to be notified and to identify, when these things are. So I think closing the loop, on things like that is where really only GRC team is focusing on that, is really
No, I think
highlight.
that's a great example. And in that context, Alan, would you want the GRC team to at least understand what are GitHub branch protection policies? Should they log on to GitHub, look at it? Maybe they don't have to log. What I'm trying to understand is that how far, what is technical and how far should they go?
Yeah. Uh, yeah. I think obviously you have to understand what the configuration is intended to do, right? And whether the functionality of that configuration or that setting or whatever it is, that piece of code, is actually doing what is intended in terms of meeting the risk or meeting the audit requirement. But the superpower is not. We do not claim to be experts in knowing all the different configuration settings, that GitLab or GitHub have to offer, and be able to like select the one and be like, hey, this is the one, that makes us good. It's
Totally.
like we have the conversation, right? With engineers, like, hey, we translate the requirement. This is what the intent is. This is why, right? It's not even just like this is the requirement. This is the bad stuff that could happen, right? This is the stuff that could go wrong, that could introduce risk, right, to our environment if this happens. And I find that the ability to do that, for a lot of GRC teams is missing, right? They just go straight to like the control requirement or whatever. Like this is what the control says. It's like no, you got to explain to them, right? Your relationship will be a lot more effective, with the partner teams, especially engineering, if you explain to them what objective do you have? Like, what is the thing you're trying to prevent? Or what is the thing you're trying to implement to prevent some bad thing happening or some non-intended thing happening? Right. And then you have the conversation. Then you work together. Once that is understood, then it becomes easy. It's like, oh yeah, we have this. Oh, we have this. Or we can do this. Like, and then you just lay out all the options together and together pick the right option, that is natural and in the right flow
Makes
of what they're
sense.
doing.
Makes sense. So the GRC team is more almost like a prosecutor, right? You're asking questions and you're trying to sort of get to a logical conclusion, right? And trying to sort of bring people along with you towards that conclusion. The developer,
Exactly.
obviously, in this case, an engineer, does not also understand what the branch protection policies are because that's not their job. So, who is supposed to understand or provide guidance on what are the right policies that they should be using, and if you're using the right policies or not? Who should make that sort of determination?
Well, I mean, I disagree. Maybe I think the engineers or somebody on the engineering team should know what all the branch policies are and what they do, right? So I don't believe that GRC should be the expert on knowing what are all the branch policies are and which one or which ones are the ones to turn on, to meet a requirement. It's again, the flow is like, hey, this is what we're trying to do. What kind of options, what kind of implementation options do we have using the tool set and using the natural
Got it.
flow of your
No,
process, right?
just to be very clear, my argument was not that the GRC teams should be experts on GitHub branch protection policies. What I'm trying to ask you is that most likely, if I'm an engineer, I'm developing a Go or a Python app, right? And I know the basic commands on Git. I know the policies with respect to merge and how do I promote code through a pull request and all that. But I'm not an expert on all the security features on GitHub. That's the security team's responsibility,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
So, and so what I think I'm going back to an earlier statement. So the GRC becomes a glue in all of this, right? You're bringing security along with you because they have they're technically supposed to have the insights on this, and then you're bringing the engineers along with you because they're operating on some of this on a daily basis, right? And the role of the GRC is to oversee these two functions and make sure that we are all sort of working together. Is that a reasonable thing to say?
Correct. And doing it in the context of compliance, right? So like doing it in the context of, okay, it's not, that's like half of it. That's like picking the solution to meet the requirement is half of it. The other half is implementing things to monitor to make sure that continues to be effective and continues to be
Got it.
operational,
Got
right?
it.
And that's the part. And also like doing the uncovering the blind spots is like, yeah, that's happy path, but what about the not happy path?
Beautifully.
What could go wrong,
So,
right?
so in
That,
some
that
ways, the role that QA used to play in the, or at least the traditional QA that we know it in software development chains, right, where they are able to look at the code and they are able to understand all the different paths, not just the happy path, right?
correct,
Okay.
correct, correct.
You said something that it is just passing audits involves more than what you think. I think you made the statement. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so just I mean, like bad GRC teams, right? This is an audit comes up, they're crossing their fingers, they can't sleep at night before the audit comes because they know there's problems. They know engineers are gonna hate them, when the audit season comes because they're gonna dump a bunch of requests and have to send a bunch of nag mails. So that's what bad GRC teams do. Like good GRC teams, the audit should be should be a repeatable process, right? That's kind of planned and budgeted for with no surprises. And this goes back to like the importance of having a good control effectiveness monitoring, program. If
Got
you
it.
have that and that's healthy, the audits, shouldn't be stressful, right? So like there's a lot of stuff that goes into audits before the actual audit happens. But when the actual audit actually happens, um, and this goes back to, how do you become a good GRC partner, to your stakeholders, to your engineers, is planning. Like it comes back to PM skills, like PM 101 skills, planning, work back planning, like negotiating with your auditors, like, what are the milestones? What are the SLAs, for turning around evidence, right? And reviews. A lot of that is like on the auditor side, which I hold them accountable for a lot, because they have their own timelines and sometimes their timelines impact ours, and the worst thing you want is like something that was closed or you thought was closed for like 2 months, and then the week before audit report issuance they open something up because management review caught something that the team missed, right? So yeah, executing on coordinating the audits, like you gotta let your engineers know like it's coming. Ideally, if it's like a recurring audit, you have all of the prior evidence easily, referenced and stored somewhere and be able to access so they can quickly look at what was provided, in the prior year and it'll jog their memory because engineers don't remember. Like they don't remember what like they see a request and they're like, oh, what did I give them last time? Oh, this is what I gave them last time. Boom, I know exactly what to give them now, right? So having that, giving them way ahead of time, like in submitting a ticket in their regular flow of like the tool that they actually work in, normally from day to day, with the due date that's reasonable. Like at least 2 weeks. None of this like 2-day turnaround stuff. Um, if they can't meet that due date, have them propose another one, and then hold them accountable, for committing to that one. And then only, sending the nag mail after that, and any kind of escalations that are needed at that point should be not a surprise, because they, committed to it. Um, and and issue resolution, right? Like being able to uh take take an engineer through, an instance of where like an auditor is asking a question, but they don't really know how to answer it or interpret it, like, doing that translation and interpretation, uh, representing the domain on behalf, of engineers is also a trait of a good engineering team. Like if you're competent enough and knowledgeable enough to represent that process or control on behalf of an engineer to the auditors, then the engineer's life is like, oh, great, thank you, GSC, you took care of it for us.
Got it.
Being able to self-serve evidence ourselves, goes a long way as well. Like the hardest part is actually just getting approved to access the systems. But after that, like it's just a quick meeting with the owner to walk you through, what buttons to click, where to go,
Yeah.
and then boom, like you're gonna get that. So there's
W-
like a lot of, again, GRC
So what
misunderstood
does
because like a lot of things that GRC does behind the scenes that shields, the other stakeholders in the
totally,
organization
totally.
are not
So
kind of.
what is fascinating to me, Alan, I think you make a fantastic point about the project management skills of a GRC, right? And the ability for them to be able to corral these things together and to be able to keep things on time, on target. But some of the arguments that you make around being that representative and the voice of the engineer to auditors are exactly the same reasons why others are making the argument that GRC should be technical. But yet you're making it. I don't know if you're saying the GRC team should not be technical, but you're using the same arguments to say that they're more project managers than
Yeah.
technical. I don't want to use the word engineers, but than having engineering chops. Why?
Yeah. Uh, so like recently I've been doing like a lot of more browsing on LinkedIn. In the past I haven't really done much of it, but recently I've noticed that there's some more interesting, posts and discussions that I like to engage myself in. So like GRC engineering, GRC isn't technical enough. They should be learning how to uh, run scripts, build things to automate evidence collection
You're
fast.
referring to the GRC.engineering, Ayub Fandi, a bunch
Yeah,
of Charles. Okay, got it. Yeah,
yeah,
please go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. Along with other, just like the general kind of statement of like GRC is not technical enough. Like again, technical is, I'm not really sure how, like, what everybody has a different definition of what technical, means and what not technical enough means. I just believe that, there's you obviously have to understand the processes and the controls and the domains, that each control is about to be able to, at a high level, explain and relay to an auditor of like, this is how the control operates, right? This is the risk, and this is how the control operates, and this is how you test it. This is where the evidence is. This is how we monitor it. But, you know, I think a lot of the technical part is like the complaints is like, oh, GRC should be doing more, right? Than that. GRC should be uh, building metrics, building assurance signals, and monitoring that as part of the C part of GRC. I kind of disagree with that, right? Like if that's the area that we're talking about, in terms of technical um, skill set, that's the area I kind of disagree with, right? I think building metrics, building assurance metrics, building health signals should be the responsibility of the control owners, right? Of those teams that actually
And
own.
what if the control owners are not doing it?
Then you got it. Then you have another option is like maybe you do need to build a GRC engineering team, right? But I'm saying accountability goes a long way, right? It kind of goes back to like, just what I said was like a small thing is like control owners need to acknowledge their responsibilities and be accountable for their controls kind of end to end, right? It's not enough to just say, yeah, I implemented the control and I operate the control. How are you gonna, if you're a security engineer, how are you gonna look your CISO in the eye and be like, yeah, my control is healthy, right? When they ask you, without having a metric, that is continuously pushing out some signal, right? And I don't
Got it.
think GRC should be the team that's building that or owning that, right? They should be the ones that are building it and owning it because they're responsible for it. And then, if GRC wants to kind of like do some aggregation or reporting to like pull in the signals to kind of uh, gauge, score control effectiveness, then that's fine. But like the core inputs, signals, should be coming from the control owners. Now, if they don't do that, then yeah, I mean, maybe like a GRC engineering team, has to be built. But even at Microsoft, like massive organization, like we didn't really have a GRC engineering team. Like we had a dedicated engineering team to support the compliance team in terms of like tooling. But even then, it was still pulling from signals, that each of the control owning teams were pushing out
Got it. Got it.
because that
So
accountability is key. Like
I,
without
I
that,
think you're bringing up an excellent point. So what you're basically saying is that you're not opposed to this idea of signals and metrics. In fact, you're making an argument that they should exist, and that goes to the idea of repeatable sort of compliance that you talked about. What you're questioning is that who are the owners of it? Where should it actually the responsibility lie or the accountability lie? Is it the GRC team or is it the control owners? And your argument is it should default to the control owners unless for whatever reason they are not able to do it, then the GRC team can take responsibility. But the default position should be with the control owners. That's
yeah.
your argument.
I mean, otherwise, like GRC is always gonna have to play catch up, right? I mean, how many times does control change, right? Or we're moving to another tooling stack, right? We're implementing it a
Yep.
little differently. Like GRC is gonna have to keep up all the time and be a little bit behind all the time
Got it.
to update the metrics, the assurance signals. Like the control owning team makes a change, like, hey, the expectation is you own a control, you implement it, you own the design, the implementation, you own the monitoring, right? The control effectiveness monitoring, pushing out the signals that teams can use, to assess, the
Got it.
effectiveness score.
But
So,
the
yeah.
one question I want to ask you on that is that do you see this as a shared responsibility? And let me explain. So if you remember in the age-old days of the IDS, intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system, right? You write all these different rules and everybody has their own idea in terms the network team has a way in terms of looking at network packets, the security team has a perspective, so on and so forth. But there is a common platform that is written on which you write these rules. So somebody maintains the platform and others participate in writing these different rules for the different use cases. Do you see this as a shared responsibility between GRC teams and the control owners, or do you think that the entire automation generation of signals lies with the control owners?
Again, in my opinion, like if those signals are intended to measure the effectiveness of a control or a process that's owned by those teams, then they should be the ones that own it. Now, GRC is like heavily consulted and heavily like influencing the design of it because a lot of times, let's be honest, like even security engineers, you tell them to create a metric, to like measure the effectiveness of a control. Their metric is going to be some metric that doesn't actually really, measure like control effectiveness. Like again, only GRC team thinks like that because they're typically like ex auditors and they know how auditors kind of test and validate the effectiveness of controls. Most other teams outside of GRC aren't thinking like that. So GRC needs to be heavily involved in saying, hey, like this metric is okay, fine. This metric is good if you want that, fine. But it's this metric over here that's measuring coverage, that's measuring operating
Got it.
effectiveness, right?
Got it.
That we need, to feel good about compliance and passing
So
audits.
I think what you're basically saying, Alan, is that your argument is that the GRC, and you use the word ex auditors, the GRC team is essentially prosecuting these requirements and standards, right, and for compliance and security, and they are sort of ex auditors, and they have to be technical enough to your earlier point, but you don't see that as an engineering function. And you think the engineering function is best left with the engineers. That's sort of the crux of what the argument that you're making.
Correct. And going back to my GRC and misunderstood opening statement, specifically being specifically engineering teams or even security engineering teams having the wrong expectations of what of what GRC teams skill sets are and role is Like, think about it this way, right? Under a CISO, all these security teams, most of them are security engineers, right? Most of them are security engineering teams that are the actual engineers. GRC, if it for the GRC teams that sit under security or the CISO, they're probably like the only team that are not actual engineers, right? Like, I mean, I consider us PMs, right? Not products, right? The P is not for products; it's for program, right? Compliance program managers and project management, or as well, like some product and program and projects. Um, so m- most engineers are used to PMs being like TPMs, right? Working with the devs, the engineers to do all
TPMs
the
as
kind
in
of
technical product managers.
correct,
Yeah.
correct, correct. And the T is the key part of that, right? When you put the T in, most of the time, like you're straight up like heavily partnered with the devs and day to day scrums like design, continuously planning when things get off track, like solutioning, like all that kind of stuff, right? And like personal experience, right? Like we had a come to come to Jesus moment, with one of my security engineer dev, managers. And they're like, well, like we expected GRC to do all these things, right? To like lead the design, lead the solutioning, like when things go wrong, put us back on track. And that was really eye-opening because I was like, "Really? Like, we don't do that." We're not TPMs in the traditional TPM role within, an engineering team, right? Like, we don't do that. We're PMs, we're masters, and we're experts of the compliance program, of the organization. So, we're not we're not engineers. We don't have most of us don't have engineering backgrounds to program to, like, be able to catch all these things and provide that direction and challenge things when people are shipping code, right? It's like we explain what the end goal needs to be. We provide guidance on like how what was going to stand up, when we get audited, and from like just general compliance perspective. And you guys bring us along. Like you guys do your thing. We'll check it. We'll validate it. We'll co-design it, but we're not going to be operating like an actual TP. And like once they figure that out, they're like, "Oh, okay, like I'm glad we had this conversation because, we saw like GRC PM, in your guys' titles and roles, and we expected you to kind of operate as like a TPM in terms of what they've been used to, right? Like in larger tech organizations." So that realization kind of was eye opening for both sides. And after that, it was great because it was like, okay, well, now we no longer have this expectation. Now our expectation for what GRC is providing as part of this initiative or this effort is clarified, is clear to us what you guys are doing and what you guys aren't doing. And after that, it was great. We were like, yeah, I mean, this is what we do very well. This is what we know how to do very well. This is what we're not
Got it.
doing. And then we're successful that way.
You gave a shout out to Charles Noato, and particularly, I think, in the context of what you were saying is repeatable compliance. And you said Charles I think, he's a big proponent of this idea of security GRC plus assurance. He talked about
Correct.
continuous assurance.
Correct.
In the context that you just described within your organization, how do you create continuous assurance?
Again, ideally, like control owners would be responsible for pushing metrics or signals, that would represent control effectiveness, like continued control effectiveness. So, like metrics, right? Metrics in an MBR, for example, right? Each sub team under the CISO owns their areas of controls, owns their areas, and pushes out metrics on a monthly basis that get reviewed in an MBR, all up to the CISO, and they're at like P0 metrics, right? So you see all the things that are green, all the things that are yellow, all the things that are red, and then it's right there. It's like, okay, and you map the controls to them, right? Like this metric maps to this control, this GRC control over here, right? So it's easy to see the status and the health, of things, and it's easy to pinpoint kind of the problem areas that are either, at risk to security or at risk to passing our audits. And GRC was involved in the build and the designing, of those metrics to make sure, like I said, like a metric might be useful to security, but it actually is really irrelevant, to to compliance, to GRC team in terms of getting assurance, that the control is operating effectively for audits. Um, and we periodically like audit those metrics too. Like I can't, we had a security leader that was like, proudly sharing, a top level metric, that was all green, like to the board. And then like a few months later, we kind of poked at it a little bit and found out like something was broken, right? So like the metric was actually like inaccurate and reliable, right? So like GRC team again are the only ones that are really kind of poking, at those things and like thinking about, hey, everything like seems good,
Yeah, yeah.
but like, is it actually good? Like under the hood, is it actually good? So that's another thing. Like automation. A lot of people are like pushing automation and experience more inefficiencies, getting audited. But I'm like, that sounds nice, but like, who's auditing the automation, right? Like, the automation needs to be audited too, right? You can't just kind of blindly
Fair
trust.
point. Fair point. I think what I'm hearing you say is that, especially in the context of continuous assurance, you're almost sort of advocating two things. One, the publisher consumer model, where control owners publish information, GRC teams consumes. And then the second point that I'm hearing you say is that you almost talk about the GRC team as an observability plane. They are almost they are the auditors. I don't know what the connotation for the word auditor is in this context. You're auditing the process and the standards and the requirements of the organization, and you're reporting on it, right?
Correct. Correct. I had a again partner like director of security on our product security side. He was like, "Hey, Alan, I want your team to battle test us. Like, I want
Mm.
you to keep us honest, right? Like, if you can audit our metrics and like audit our controls, like, but I want to be battle tested against your team, right?" And I did exactly that. I was like, "Awesome, that's what I want to do," right? And some of those exercises uncovered weaknesses or inaccuracies, in the assurance signals that they're pushing out, the metrics that are pushing out. So like, okay, well, actually the way you've configured this query to push out this metric is missing, the inclusion of new services coming in that are, constantly coming in. It's just looking at old stuff and not updating, right? Which makes the metric meaningless, to a compliance perspective, because when an auditor comes in, they're going to catch that, right? They're going to catch that exclusion, right, of coverage.
Do you have any favorite assurance metrics, Anand?
Uh, I mean, it's going to be based on whatever the controls is, right? So like I like out of SLA, metrics. Right now, like if you're just talking like a volume control, right? Like, okay, then again, security engineers, their metrics that they're gonna push is like how many are critical, how many are high, how many are medium. I'm like, great, that's fine. That might be useful to you, but I'm actually concerned about which ones are out of SLA, per
Yeah,
the
totally.
SEV, level. So that's like an example of like how GRC can guide, on them, like what are the right metrics that actually measure, control effectiveness. Um, so really I'm I don't have a favorite metric. I'm more concerned about the right metric, that can measure effectiveness of each control. Um, and and this kind of maybe dovetail into like another topic about auditors, and controls. Like there's a deception. There's a big deception, right, in the audit world, right, where SOC 2 report, produces unqualified opinion and everybody thinks everything is good. Security is great, blah blah blah. But the way the auditors are testing, right? Even for like SOC 2 type 2 audits, which is a period of time, right? Which is not like a point in time, it's a period of time. So the intent or the expectation is that like you're covering the whole period of time. It's like, how do auditors test automated controls? It's a point in time test. It's a point in time test. They tell you to show the configuration, and if it's before the period end date, like that's how they test it, right? But it could have not been compliant, the 10 months before the point in time snapshot of the configuration that they did, in November, right? If your period end is like calendar year. So the how I would like to see like the audit industry move forward is and also improving like overall security assurance, right? Is through looking at the metrics, looking at like having encouraging metrics, continuous metrics. So like let's say you have a monthly metric that pushes out, green or red, right? For this configuration, this peer review merge request, going back to the other example, right? GitLab, GitHub setting, for all the repos, if it's not centralized, to be green. Well, in that control, like an auditor usually would test black or white. It's binary. It's like, okay, is your setting set? Yes or no. At this point in time in November, yes or no. If it is, then you're good. Right? That control is green, passes. If it's not, then GRC's teams kind of scramble and like make it green, and then provide that snapshot. Right? I'm just being real here. But that's farce, right? Because like everybody knows, like that's the limited, way of auditors kind of doing that test and that means one thing. It doesn't mean the whole story. So if you had a metric that was pushing out a signal of which repos, right, are set properly and which ones aren't, and you're looking at that regularly, like monthly, and you have a fast, turnaround to identify like a problem and then rectify the problem, remediate the problem. And then auditors shift towards testing that as like a monitoring control as opposed to like a binary control, right? Right now, nobody's going to do that because you're essentially saying, "Hey, auditor, here are all the times when it was red." So the auditor's going to be like, "Oh, oh, 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 like exception, 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 like all yeah, 5 times throughout the year, you were non-compliant, right? Thanks for giving us all your dirty laundry." But I would like the audit kind of industry to move towards changing those controls to be kind of continuous reviewing and monitoring these continuous metrics and continuous assurance signals, and say, okay, it's okay if you have a red as long as you have a process to like review them and rectify the situation within some sort of SLA that you have, right? I mean, the CSA has issued continuous audited continuous metrics for a few years. I saw, Raj, you're part of the working group that contribute towards that. I sat on a couple like sessions before, and I'll be honest, it was like seems like it was slow moving, and like
Yeah.
I think auditors were the biggest hang up, right? Because they just can't get over the hump of not testing it like a binary control. And it's not all their fault either, because some of the standards like PCI, for example, like are mandating that it has to be like that, right? All the time. Right. So it's like you get into this game that everybody plays is like, okay, how do we get clean, for an audit?
It is a You're
Yeah,
making a very interesting point. I think what you're basically saying is that in you want the audit industry to move from, I think I'm just summarizing exactly what you're saying, which is from a snapshot view of audit to much more a continuous monitoring view of audit, which means that you want signals to be pushed periodically, you want this to be evaluated based on assurance metrics, right?
correct,
And sort of you are actually advocating for a lot more automation than what exists today,
correct,
right, in order to make this
right,
happen. Now, one question I want to ask you is that I think one of the challenges that most engineers feel, and I think it almost cascades, right? Engineers want to give only enough information to security teams. Teams want to give only enough information to the GRC teams, and the GRC teams want to only give enough information to auditors, right? It's almost like just, only on a need to know basis.
yeah,
But if you are advocating for continuous monitoring, it is in some ways you are actually being much more transparent,
100%.
right? How do
You,
you
you've
sort
been
of reconcile this?
you've been much more transparent. You have way better security assurance. Have way better maturity in your program. But the thing that prevents all that, like puts that all to a halt, is customers expecting perfection in vendor
Mm.
SOC 2 reports. Right? Or else like a whole bunch of headache comes with that, like follow-up questions. Oh, why'd you have an exception here? What are you guys doing about it? Like, manager responses only go so far, right? I think until the industry changes and shifts, from expecting perfection in SOC 2 audit reports for vendors, like and auditors or auditors accept this new way of designing controls and like testing the controls to where you can still produce a clean audit report, right? Um, it'll continue. Like no company is going to be like, hey, I want to be the first to be like, just disclose everything, right?
Yep.
Disclose all our
Yep.
dirty laundry from all the measures, even though it shows that your program is way more mature than another company that doesn't do that and just kind of plays a song and dance during an audit,
Totally, totally.
right?
You
Yeah.
you were an ex-auditor, Alan. What do
Yeah.
you think the auditor or in the auditing industry should do to move towards what you're saying?
I think auditors just need to be more open. And I see, this maybe dovetail into like the differences I see between large firms, like big four audit firms versus like smaller ones. Pros and cons of each, and it's also team based. But I think auditors just need to be open, right? They just need to be open. Like SOC 2 controls are very customizable, right? Compared to like PCI and other more prescriptive, standards. SOC 2 control is very, very customizable. So I think they just need to be open for a GRC team or an organization to be like, hey, like this is what we're doing, and we feel like it's better. We would like to move in this direction. We would like you to be our partner in innovating, and evolving with us to move in this direction, um, and be okay with it, right? Like, uh, I would love to put an auditor, an audit team on the spot and be like, hey, why do you think you can't move to this, this kind of model? Now, before all of that, though, easier said than done because you can have all the health signals, all the metrics, but like if you got a ton of reds, like are you able to like rectify,
Yep,
timely? So like that's
yep.
another problem first. Like you got to fix that in house internally first and be solid before you even pitch this approach, to an auditor. But I think after that is solid, like you just gotta push, pitch that to an auditor, right? And they need to be open to it. They might need to audit extra stuff though, right? They're gonna need to audit the metrics. They're gonna need to audit the automation, right? They're gonna need to audit all the things that are the IP, like the completeness and accuracy, of the things that we're pushing over as new evidence, as a new form of evidence now, right? So I think it's just openness, right? I think it's openness.
Got it.
Yeah.
Do you think beyond, I mean, is there anything else that is stopping the auditors today from moving towards it other than being transparent and open and curious to learn?
I mean, I think a lot of auditors are lacking. Okay, now that we're talking about lacking technical skills, maybe this is where it comes in. A lot of auditors haven't been part of second line of defense. Like a GRC team. Like my personal experience, I started out as PwC. I'll be honest. I'll admit it. I was a checklist auditor. I didn't know what I was doing. I was learning, like soaking everything in as a sponge, trying to survive and trying to not sound dumb, in meetings when I was talking to people that I was auditing, that I was supposed to be auditing. Um, but it didn't come quick, and it didn't really sink in until I joined like a GRC team as part of a company, right? Like, as part of Microsoft and Bing. Because then I was sitting next to engineers, working with them every single day, helping them, design, develop, monitor, run the whole program, to where I really understood where they're how they're thinking, what their ways of working were, and like how we could actually integrate and translate and marry the compliance stuff with engineering processes, right? So I think it's just, a lot of auditors are junior too, right? Like junior team members, just fresh out, in their careers. Which you can't ding them for that, but I think the more experienced, team members need to step in a little bit more, right? And say and be more open and understand, okay, this is how they're doing it, and this is why it makes sense. We should change our testing approach to validate what they're doing, as opposed to like the checklist auditor test procedure style for this type of control, right? Selecting 25 samples, taking a screenshot of whatever it is.
Got it. Got it. Um, do you, in your current role, Alan, at Grammarly, do you work with customers today?
Yeah, so as part of moving from a large organization, big pond, little fish, to like a smaller pond, wear more hats, and so I frequently get pulled into like sales conversations, right? When prospective customers or existing customers have questions about our security, our compliance, and we also do TPRM as well, right?
Got it.
So assessing
When we
vendors.
spoke last, you said something very interesting. You said on a broadly speaking, the GRC teams are better at talking to customers. Am I right? And can you explain, elaborate for our listeners why that is?
Better at talking to customers, better at talking to auditors, better at talking to anybody that's not, part of their own team, right? Um, security engineers are very intelligent, right? They're the most like intelligent, people, partners that I've worked with. But it's almost to like a fault, right? So, um, it, a lot of conversation. You ask them a question, they're gonna answer the question, right? They don't really know what the actual question was sometimes. And that's a fault of an auditor too. Like an auditor asks very open-ended, vague questions, as a trap, sometimes as a trap too. And they're catching engineers, like by interpreting a certain way, like the absolute truth, and you know, saying a whole bunch of other stuff that's like not really relevant to either customers or auditors, right? But GRC team, because we are a customer ourselves of other vendor tools and vendor cloud services that we, are assessing and reviewing. We know what auditors are wanting, to know or need to know to kind of complete, their audit. We have that context, right? So every time we hear something, I know this is what they're actually asking. You ask the same question, and if I'm like out of the picture and it goes directly to the engineer, they're going to interpret this totally different way, right? They're going to
Mm,
give some response that's going to like go down the rabbit hole and like just roundabout thing that's like unnecessarily long. Um, so yeah, I mean I think that's a superpower. That's the true superpower of the GRC team, right? It's not technical, like being technical and like knowing how to code and like build all these tooling and cool scripts to like pull signals. It's the translation, right? It's providing the guidance for achieving the objective of passing an audit or getting through an audit or answering a customer inquiry, right, on a questionnaire, or a meeting with the information security team on a prospective customer side.
got it. You have Microsoft. You have dealt with hundreds and possibly thousands of frameworks, standards, requirements. You have been an auditor, and I think your role in PwC, you used to work with smaller companies. Is that correct?
Big and
Yeah.
small, mostly small. There's I started with the class, and it was kind of like some people got deployed onto large engagements, like the same client for multiple years, like staying there, and then other people were like deployed onto smaller projects, many clients. Pros and cons for both. Like I went the second route where I saw a lot more clients and did like smaller, audits.
Got it.
So I was
And
able to
then
see a lot more, variety, and my impact and my role was bigger because those teams are smaller versus like, a larger client with a bigger
got it.
team, Yeah.
Got it. And the reason I was asking is, what is your view of the existing standards, whether it is NIST 853, ISO 27K1, ISO 42K1, PCI DSS, any of those standards? How prescriptive are they, and how prescriptive should they be?
Yeah. Um yeah, each standard kind of serves a different purpose, right? Like PCI is like required for, taking credit cards. SOC 2 is very customizable. ISO is kind of in the middle, like sort of prescriptive, but also sort of customizable. I think they all serve a purpose. I think they, it's kind of a difficult question to answer because if you're more prescriptive, then there's more, I guess, standardization, from like a TPRM perspective is like if a customer is evaluating vendors, if it's all standardized and it's more prescriptive, then it's like, okay, if they have this cert or they have this test report, then that means they have all these things that generally the industry and every kind of vendor would have, right? On the other hand, it doesn't work well because every organization is different, right? And every organization is at different maturity levels and sophistication levels in terms of implementing the controls, to meet risks or standards and frameworks. I actually had in the past, I actually had a security lead say, "Hey, you know what? Like I'm walking in new, and I inherited all these controls, right? And they're probably like a few years old where they're designed and implemented. Like it doesn't make sense. Yeah, a lot of them don't make sense to me. We're doing them, but we're only doing them because they've been implemented in the past, and GRC team, compliance team says we have to continue doing them or else we're going to fail audits, right? We're actually doing a lot of things that we think actually meet the requirements that are not written down in the same way that these controls are, right? Um, so, and I'm like, absolutely. Like, I'm going to go on that journey with you. Like, let's sit down. Let's understand what the requirements are, what the intent is, what the risks are, and let's align, with what the team is actually doing that you believe addresses these requirements. So let's revamp, the controls list. It does not make any sense to continue doing something if if it's not like if it's not actually effective and it's not
Got it.
really needed and it's not accurately representing, what is actually being done.
So am I correct when I even hearing you? You're basically saying that the standards cannot be too specific because then every context is different, every company is different, and so they're intentionally somewhat abstract. But because they are abstract, they may not necessarily apply to you as a company, and you'll have to evaluate what applies to you and what does not apply to you.
Yeah, and the challenge is, if it's not prescriptive or is not standardized, then companies doing TPRM, have a difficult time doing their reviews, over vendors because like everybody has a SOC 2 report, but
Yeah,
one vendor's SOC 2 report can mean one thing, and then another vendor's SOC 2 report can mean another thing. They're both unqualified reports, right? But one security program, and compliance maturity can be way, more mature than the other one. So that there's challenges, right, for doing that as well.
got it. Got it.
Which nobody has
What do
answers.
you think is the current state of GRC tools, Alan, in your opinion? Where are we?
Uh, hard to say, and I'm not the expert of this because I used to work at Microsoft where we didn't buy any tools, or we had a software company where we're like, screw that, we're not buying anything, we're just building it ourselves, right? So, we had our own tools, for GRC and compliance effectiveness monitoring. Um, the little bit that I've kind of explored and read about and talked to other people about tooling, first of all, a lot of them get a bad rap, for being the sock in a box, like low cost, SOC compliance way, of achieving a report quickly and easily, but not really meaning much. So that's kind of like that stigma, that stereotype. And then for some companies that I've talked to, it seems like it works better for less mature organizations that just want to like jumpstart, get something in place, get the ball rolling, to have something to where they don't really like start from scratch and build all these things. For more mature organizations that probably have more sophisticated, control implementation and things of way of doing things, it's probably um, a lot of work, to like integrate, these tools into measuring, what it is that needs to be measured. If it's like general stuff that's like AWS or GCP, that kind of like security stuff, then I think, the tools probably work out that way. But from where I stand right now, I think at a certain scale and size, the tools are probably be insufficient, right?
And
To
why?
And
And
why?
why?
Just
Why?
because of sophistication, just because of sophistication level, and the customization and like just the velocity of like how fast things change,
Got
how
it.
controls change, right? Then you're gonna have to like keep up with it, somehow with the tooling.
Got it. Got it. And um, I think no podcast is complete without talking about generative AI. I guess in today's world. So what do you see is the role of Gen AI, large language models, small language models in GRC?
GRC, yeah. Um, First of all, I don't think AI is gonna replace any of our jobs anytime soon, right? Like AI is good at some things and is not good at other things, and the things that it's not good at is the critical thinking, right? The blind spot uncovering, the probing, right? And just like all the other things that I said, like GRC kind of has that superpower, for it to do. Yeah, it can do great things of efficiency, of like analyzing data, pre-populating stuff, making workflows kind of more efficient, populating, security questionnaires, right? Like automatically. But I think that, like, again, the true value in GRC is what I'm talking about is like that human aspect of it, right? The PM skills, the translation skills, the critical thinking skills, the hey, what about this? Bypassing, like, how do we measure actually monitor this? And just it's like risk management, right? Like, I mean, how is the AI? I mean, I guess they could, but like at this point, it's still a very human thing to be assessing risk, right? Yeah, I don't believe you
Okay.
can just look at data points and like come up with a decision, as to how to do things. It's always comparative, it's always subjective, based on the context and based on where the organization is, based on the risk appetite, of leadership. Um, yeah, that's
Got it.
kind of what I
You
think.
were saying earlier, Alan, that the the control owners produce signals, and you want them to produce at a rapid clip, right? At a very high frequency, and eventually the GRC teams consumes these signals and presents them to the auditors. And you we talked about some of the challenges with being transparent, right? You sort of very clearly articulated. But if the control owners can produce signals and the auditors can directly consume signals, if can why would we need a GRC team?
Great question. I mean, my North Star at one point, my North Star for like compliance and GRC was to actually work myself out of a job, right?
Okay.
So it's like in a world where we have these continuous, assurance signals being pumped out and then being available, like some dashboard available to auditors, dashboard available to even customers, right, to help them with TPRM assessments. Yeah, I mean, GRC teams can be slashed. Like we don't norm we no longer need to handhold so much and coordinate and facilitate like audit evidence collection and all that kind of stuff. Right. So I'm not
You're
saying like, you
you're
know,
one of the bravest men I've ever seen.
I mean, like I'm not, yeah, now, it's not gonna fully replace us. Like, we're gonna move on to other things, to like
Totally.
manage and find our next role and find our next, area of impact. But yeah, I mean, why not? Like you have the data, you have the assurance signals, you have the metrics, you have the data to do all the validations that you need as an auditor or as a customer. Yeah, auditing all the metrics, all that kind of stuff that still needs to happen, right? You can't just trust like a trust center, right? And showing green check marks. Um, but yeah, I mean that would be the goal, right? Like no more pulling evidence, manual evidence pulling, like all that kind of stuff is just like you change all your controls towards metrics and health signals, proving, evidencing control effectiveness, right? And and no more like 2 month stressful audits. Is like, no, you can dashboard's available. You can check it throughout the year as an auditor, as a customer, whenever you want. Like it's got a look back period. You can see like the pattern and the trend. Like okay, form your own opinions, about is this okay or is this something I need to ask them more about? Like what happened here? And that's yeah, the future is like kind of all self-serve kind of validation and auditing. Um,
Okay.
working myself out of a job, out of my
So if
current
you
job at least.
okay, if you are hiring today, what skills would you look for in hiring a GRC professional?
Yes. Like I said, most of the personas right in a GRC team is going to be like ex auditors, ex big four or whatever. But like I can separate it into technical skills and I'll call it PM soft skills, right? So on the technical side, familiarity with a variety of standards and frameworks, right? Like the ISOs, the SOC 2s, PCI HIPAA, whatever you need, GDPR, CSA, CCM, high trust FedRAMP. And then control design and implementation experience, right? So working closely with engineers to translate requirements, building something that fits into their natural flow, control remediation experience, control effectiveness monitoring, like through metrics, health signals, being able to explain the risk or objective behind the requirements in the standards frameworks, so engineers understand. Audit experience, ideally as third line, not just being an auditee, because yeah, both sides of the fence is valuable, to know what the context is fully. And then, efficiency using tools like workflows in Jira or Asana, Airtable, like, GRC tool that you're going to purchase, being able to just be tool savvy to know how to configure things, configure modules to design workflows.
Got it.
Um, And then the PM and the soft skill side is like, yeah, like I mentioned, planning is a big thing. Like when you're managing an audit, which is a project, uh, knowing how to do work back dates, establishing milestones, contingency plans, scoping, stakeholder communication, right? Just it's critical to know who your audience is and adapt to their preferred communication medium, attention to detail, whether it's like audit requests, engineer responses, evidence submissions. Like you gotta own all of that to make sure there's no kind of miscommunication or like misinformation that'll lead to a long-winded, clarification. Standing firm, like being competent and experienced enough to know when to stand firm, in terms of like when to push back on an auditor when they're asking for something kind of out of scope or ridiculous, knowing when to hold the line with a control owner if they're pushing back, knowing when to escalate up the management chain, and then just being, adaptable and continuous learning, right? Like always learning new things, new standards, regulations, way of doing things, AI. We Grammarly, just recently achieved the new ISO 42001 AI management standards certification. And that was a new area, for us. I mean, it doesn't really overlap too much with security and privacy like the ISO 27, 1000 series does. So that was something kind of new to us.
Got it. Got it. We are approaching almost the end of the podcast, Alan. And any podcast, audiobooks, any books you read, any mentors you follow, anything that you want to shout out that you want our listeners to hear.
Yeah, like I said, I haven't historically spent a lot of time on LinkedIn or searching for these things, but I did recently start. Based on what I've seen so far, I'd say some of the posts that I either find myself saving for later or engaging, via comments and discussion are a few, and I'll try to represent different different sides. So, like on the audit side, there's a gentleman named Troy Fine who's representing like on the SOC 2 auditor side. David Foreman, who's the CEO of Mastermind Assurance, their ISO audit expert on their side. And then on the GRC engineering side, we talked about Ayub
Yep.
Fandy. AJ Yan is also a big proponent of GRC engineering. See a lot of activity from him. Other general kind of GRC practitioners or security, CPRM, like Sahar Dahan is a vCISO, pushing out a lot of great content that I've been saving for later. Henry Stanley, I think, is on the TPRM side, pushes out some good stuff, and from the tool vendors too, like Compliance Cal yourself and
Okay.
Anecdotes, podcasts, right? Like this one, GRC Decoded. Ayub also has one for GRC engineering. The three or four guys have like the qualified opinion, with David Foreman, AJ, and Dixon. And then James Kavanaugh, like pushing out a lot of great stuff about AI safety. Just like amazing, amazing stuff. Like really comprehensive, stuff. Mappings, control implementations, risks, all about AI safety. Um, so I think those are the people
That's
that.
a fantastic list, and I think we'll put this list in the comment section as well, for folks to see. But Alan, this was a fantastic conversation, and I think you took us through a ride through your very rich experience. Um, and thank you for being on the show.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Raj, for having me on. Pleasure.